Well, first, I'd like to thank you, the organisers of the Hackney History Festival, for inviting me, coming as I do from the distant lands of Camden. So it's good to come over here to be able to talk to you this evening. I am going to talk about Hackney at 60. Years ago, I wrote a book called London Boroughs at 50 and made the terrible structural error of writing a chunk about all 32 of them. With the benefit of hindsight, perhaps writing a narrative about all of them together might have been interesting. Some were much easier to write about than others, generally the ones where most had gone wrong. The most difficult one was Harrow, not because nothing had, it's because it was hard to find really interesting things that had happened. A wonderful place, don't get me wrong. And Harrow, of course, Christmas quiz question, is the only London borough that had previously been a borough with the same boundaries in Middlesex. Anyway, what I want to do today, I am going to talk about Hackney and its 60 years, relying heavily on the first 50. And Jerry's in the audience. I want to quote something he said, heavily perspicacious, and also, just to get us going, I want to look before the London Borough of Hackney. Ask some questions about, why we need government. Why do we need government in urban areas, particularly? The challenge of urban government, very different to the challenge of national government. Look across the world today, it's very easy for national leaders to spout rubbish. I think it's harder for local leaders to do that. Local leaders have to empty the bins and make sure that their communities live sensibly with each other. And there were periods in Hackney's history when it didn't work out quite like the London Borough of Hackney's history. But I want to go back just to, and Jerry touched on this fact, that of course, as recently as the 18th century, Hackney was a collection of villages in Middlesex. So, quoting Roy Porter in his excellent Social History of London, he wrote that Poplar, Old Ford, Clapton, and Leighton, all these remained picturesque villages. We're talking about the 18th century here. Both stretched over the Lee Bridge towards Stratford, and Bromley's main street hugged the River Lee. To the south, the Isle of Dogs remained a rough pasture, as it had been since medieval times. Along Millwall Embankment stood the 7 windmills that gave the place its name. So we're talking here about something that's well within London by the middle of the 19th century, but it's just it's villages in the Middlesex countryside. By the 19th century, in the same book, Emerson also gazed east. Hackney, Clapton, Dalston comprised, he believed, it may surprise us nowadays, still today, one of the handsomest suburbs of London. Hackney still wore an old-fashioned air. Dalston has thrown out long lines of handsome villas across the fields and orchards on the southwest. Clapton has developed itself on the northern and the northeast and down the marshes, and now large hives of manufacturing industry. The creation of Victoria Park had enhanced nearby holdings. Now, of course, at this time, parishes, originally church parishes becoming civil parishes via their vestries, become the basis of what is to become Government of London today. So the civil parish of Hackney in this large tract, not dissimilar to the equivalent tract in Islington or St Pancras or Marylebone, these large rural areas, vastly bigger than the tiny parishes back in the West End, which were, places like St Paul's, Covent Garden, tiny, tiny parish, lots of good cartoons from people like Rowlandson and Gilray about them feasting at the ratepayers' expense. But these parishes to the north, largely rural, very, very different. Hackney, at this point, came to embrace Stoke Newington. Sorry, Stoke Newington residents. But perhaps more interesting is Shoreditch to the south. Because Shoreditch to the south, of course, on the very edge of the city, like its neighbour Finsbury, becomes part of the urban sprawl of London. The City of London doesn't move its boundaries, never did, which is why all of London's government is as it is today, because the city never changed its boundaries. But out there, you've got in Shoreditch, the vestry of St Leonard's, Shoreditch, really a very different kind of place emerging. Urban sprawl, just to the north of the City of London, and to going to the discussion you were having at the end of the previous session, the radicalism, I think, that spilled out into both Finsbury and into Shoreditch was in part as a response, Jerry will shake or nod his head at this, a response to the city, which, then as today was a very controlled, commerce-oriented place, and radicals went north. So there's a history there for Finsbury as well. I think Shoreditch Vestry, very interesting place. It was commended during the 19th century for dealing with a cholera epidemic, dealing with a severe outbreak of smallpox in 1871. It built a public mortuary. They found that food adulteration was rife in the vestry, and actually they provided public services. My point is a simple one, doesn't really need to be made, that once you have a very densely populated and quite poor urban area, you need government. And the parish, or the vestry of St Leonard's, provided it. It also, and I walked past it on the way up today, had the most sumptuous vestry hall of any in London. The luxury hotel that was the Shoreditch Vestry Hall, you look at it and you think, a vestry built this in a poor part of the city. Most extraordinary building. But there it was, like many civic buildings when local government was coming into its most powerful period throughout Britain. Even the vestry was representing that through a physical manifestation, through a building, the grandest in London. And I think it does reinforce the idea that government, local government, city government is important, the bigger and more densely populated the city is. Shoreditch the vestry wasn't perfect. In the 1870s and 1880s, it was frequently criticised for its pothouse factions and constant recriminations between different groups of vestrymen. Sure, that doesn't even happen in politics today. And the general disorderliness of its meetings. I'm sure the mayor doesn't allow that. In the 1880s, both the vestry clerk and the surveyor were past their prime, a bit ageist this bit, so trigger warning. The latter being dismissed in 1887 because of his advanced age and infirmity. It doesn't say what it was the age was. This is, again, we're still with Roy Porter here. And in marked contrast with both the vestry's previous and subsequent records, no more capital loans were incurred during this period, so it sort of went into retreat. So I'm not going to go in elaborate detail through the world of the metropolitan boroughs of Shoreditch, Hackney, and Stoke Newington. That would be for another lecture on another day. What I want to come forward to now is the evolution of the London Borough of Hackney, which of course put together those three previous metropolitan boroughs. So there was a Royal Commission on London Government in the late 1950s and early 60s, the Herbert Commission, and it proposed the creation of a Council for Greater London. This is something that my predecessors at the LSE, particularly a very grand academic called William Robson, had lobbied for years. This great sprawl of city that had developed with 8.5 or 9 million people in it, with only the London County Council running the middle area, the inner London area as we'd call it, as we'd see it today. Herbert proposed the creation of such a Council for Greater London and 51 Greater London Borough Councils with populations of between 100,000 and 250,000. The London Borough, was to be the primary unit of government in London, and many of the functions of the then existing counties, including the London County Council, would be better performed, it was believed, by these new boroughs. Pause for a second. Now, this is quite a radical change in itself, because you're taking the taking the London County Council, an incredibly powerful organisation. Some of you may have been, Jerry was, at an event a few weeks ago talking about the LCC, which is 60 years, its demise is 60 years to this year, in the way that the borough's starting point and the GLA's starting point is 25 years. So the LCC had been an incredibly powerful organisation with hospitals and also kind of mini welfare state. So breaking it up and handing its powers downwards, as it was seen by some people, to these boroughs, admittedly bigger than the previous boroughs, was a very radical change in a number of ways at once. Then there was the issue of what to do with the City of London. the ancient city, which had fought all the way through the 19th century, read Jerry's books on this subject, 20th century, again and again and again, the city had fought off efforts to expand its boundaries in a way that, say, the city of Paris's boundaries had been moved out, but not a bit of it. So, and the Herbert Commission, the 1960 Commission, dryly noted, and I quote, "Logic has its limits, and the position of the city lies outside them." So it was proposed by the Royal Commission to keep the city to the south. That again has an implication to the north, and indeed to the south and the west and the east, because it keeps up the idea that you're going to have a collection of boroughs and to some extent try to feed off the wealth of the city created around it. So a number of the Herbert Commission's boroughs come into existence as originally proposed: Newham, Merton, and where else? Harrow. They exist today with the boundaries that were proposed by Herbert. But most didn't get past the Royal Commission stage, though many formed the building blocks for the subsequent mergers of the previous boroughs in the 1963 London Government Act. Herbert had proposed the borough of Finsbury, Holborn, and Shoreditch. So Shoreditch would have joined its radical neighbour Finsbury and its actually rather affluent neighbour Holborn into a single borough. In the end, it was broken up. That imagined borough was broken up partly into Islington, partly into Camden, and obviously partly into Hackney, although briefly Shoreditch was proposed by the government to go into Tower Hamlets. So obviously you can see in all of this, and I'll come back to it at the very end of what I'm going to say, reorganisations of local government lead to very strange decisions which don't have much to do with local community very often. But I'll come back to that when I come to talk about the future. So Shoreditch comes into Hackney, the new London Borough of Hackney. Within the London County Council area, now inner London, Conservative boroughs, including Kensington and Chelsea, not Kensington and Chelsea, Kensington, Chelsea, and Westminster, were enthusiastic for the proposed reforms. Most Labour boroughs and the LCC, the London County Council, opposed them. Two didn't oppose them, and they were, breaking ranks, Labour Party being what it is, Fulham and Hackney. My guess is, and somebody in the room may know the answer to this, Hackney was much bigger than Stoke Newington and Shoreditch in terms of population. So my guess is that the burghers of the old borough of Hackney saw this as an opportunity to expand and take over the other two. Anybody agree with that? You must be a local historian. Yep, somebody's got the thumbs up in the front row here. So obviously the London County Council opposed its own demise. Many Labour boroughs within London supported the council's position, but not Hackney. And Labour accused the Conservatives at the time, not without reason, of wanting to expand London, and thus, given that the London County Council had been continuously Labour-run since 1934 by what journalists at the time described as, not entirely unkindly, a sort of Stalinist clique, Labour clique, that this was going to expand London and make it easier for the Conservatives to win it. And of course, that was an unfair observation, and indeed it proved true, because the Conservatives did win the GLC in the way that by the 1940s and 50s and 60s, they could no longer win the LCC. Now, this was big news, and it's certainly big news to people like me who are fascinated by city government, and all of you here today. And a large number of professional and other bodies put an enormous amount of time and effort into creating this new, but planners loved the idea. They saw the idea for mega plans. We're going to come on to Dalston's road system in a minute. Mega plans. They just loved it. So the Royal Town Planning Institute, the Royal Chartered Surveyors, all lobbied about planning power, seeing a strategic plan for London. However, the Conservative MP for Beckenham, that's in Bromley, not one of the places that was necessarily very enthusiastic about being dragged into this great big city, which it was proposed. Anyway, Philip Goodhart, the MP for Beckenham, remarked during the passage of the London Government Bill, quote, "I have been impressed by the lack of interest in it shown, this is the reforms, shown in my area. Since the beginning of the month, I have received more letters about the iniquities of the discrimination in the taxation on greyhound racing than on this topic." So it wasn't really, I mean, you know, those of us who love government and reforms can or anybody who goes out canvassing as a councillor will just know how people want to do other things, really, than politics. They may have political views, but they don't want to be confronted with it. So in the end, there were 32 boroughs, and then, of course, the city lived on once again. Now, so I want to move on from that brief canter through the process of reform to the context. And again, Jerry touched on this in the previous session, and earlier sessions today have touched on it as well. So books that are written about this period, and particularly about reforms of local government at the time, have generally concentrated on metropolitan citywide planning, or the central area of London. What was the coming of the GLC going to mean for big plans and for central London? The creation and abolition of the GLC have been considered in detail in a number of books. There isn't a book about the GLC, interestingly, about its whole life. Much has been written about Ken Livingstone, the GLC's final leader, and indeed the city's first directly elected mayor, while there are also publications analysing the creation of the GLA and its 20 years. Lots of studies about planning and politics in particular boroughs, and there have been books about the economy, planning, housing or development in particular authorities. And they consider parts of London or boroughs as an example. Some academics, famously my dear erstwhile colleague Michael Hebert at the LSE, looked in detail at planning in the boroughs. He was the one who brought to my attention, and indeed his book on the subject, the curiosity that such is the way the boroughs think of themselves, this is the post-65 boroughs, that if you go into many town halls, you'll find a map on the wall of the borough as if it were an island. So with just the borough shown and everything else, you might just see some vague faint mention of another borough next door, but mostly it looks as if you're looking at an island, and I think it was a fascinating observation. Each of the boroughs has evolved a distinct entity, there's no question about that. It may have taken a long time for the politics of Stoke Newington and Hackney and Shoreditch to merge, and I'm sure they still show a little bit even today, but they have significantly merged, and the boroughs have become entities in their own right. There's no question political cultures vary from one borough to another, and even the same party from borough to borough. Many years ago, let's not talk about Hackney, I said to a senior officer in Westminster, why don't you talk to your colleagues, get your councillors to talk to their colleagues in Kensington and Chelsea about this? And he just shook his head and said, different kinds of conservatives. And there's no question there are different kinds of Labour, different kinds of Liberal Democrat, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Now, some of the boroughs still with us today, Newham and Barking and Dagenham, have never changed political colour. Somebody is going to say in a moment, what do you think is going to happen when reform fights next year in some of these boroughs? We'll come on to that. Never changed political control, while others, including Ealing and Richmond, have actually moved backwards and forwards quite regularly. Labour groups in one borough, as I said, are very different from those in others. So, although the 32 boroughs and the city together constitute a vast metropolis, I mean, London, the largest city the world has ever known, now, of course, even if you consider London the wider southeast, there are cities all over the world bigger now, but London still kept its remarkable totemic status as a leading world city, in some ways, in a way that the UK has not managed to retain its status in quite the same way. That's a lecture for another day. Individual characteristics have led to different politics and policies, so a sweep across the contemporary inner London skyline is instructive. Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea, apart from a few Labour government-funded hotel blocks in the 60s, have fought off tall buildings. Another square bracket, there was a proposal in the Royal Commission on London Government to put the city in Westminster, a single borough of the city in Westminster. And if that had happened, there'd be no tower blocks in the city. That shows you why boundaries matter. There'd have been no towers in the city at all, because Westminster, which would have been by far the dominant partner, doesn't like towers. Anyway, that's another borough and in another world. Elsewhere, you've got boroughs, and Camden has a similar policy. But the City of London now, for a time, avoided building tall buildings, and then Canary Wharf came along, and Liberty Hall up go tall buildings. Tower Hamlets as pro-development under its current mayor as it's possible to be. So Tower Hamlets is now encouraging tall buildings. Hackney does to the south. I was walking up again today. On the edge of the city, you can see juicy towers that must have produced a lot of Section 106 and sill on the way up through Hackney and South Islington. And why not? Southwark, Lambeth, Wandsworth, all along the South Bank, talk to the leaders in those boroughs, and they'll say, you know, our population don't mind about tall buildings. They just want lots of development because we want lots of money to spend in the neighbourhoods. So, you know, the shifting politics and attitudes towards development are amazing. So we've seen major towers constructed not just in the city, but along the city fringe, in Tower Hamlets and in Hackney, or Shoreditch, and the Shoreditch part of Hackney and South, and indeed in parts of southern Islington. And of course, Lewisham Town Centre, Redbridge, North Acton in Ealing, all have their own mini clusters of towers. Again, if there'd been a single government for London, as in New York, that would never have happened. But because the city didn't move its boundaries, we've been left, I'm not blaming the city with the system we've got. So the economic and social conditions at the time, of course, were significantly different to the Hackney or the world of Hackney and the London boroughs today. So the boroughs took office almost exactly 20 years after the Second World War. There were bomb sites everywhere still. And in the 60s, nothing to do with this reform, though you could argue that it was not entirely inconsistently coincident, Britain changed. Social change, architectural change, a whole raft of things happened at once. Loads of social legislation in the late 1960s. David Kynaston, the historian, wrote the Profumo affair, everybody will remember that, was one of the things that switched the English default position in politics from deference to skepticism. People suddenly realized what their elders and betters were getting up to and thought, well, why can't we live like that? So the boroughs came into existence as this new world emerged at the same time. And although the local authorities with amalgamations of councils had their origins in the Victorian period, they did emerge in a world that was changing very quickly. Population of London, which had reached 8.5 million in 1939, was falling. In inner London, it had been falling since 1910, 1920. So there was a radical deindustrialization, radical fall in population, and there were projections at the time that inner London's population might fall as low as 7 million. It actually fell to 6.6 million. So these projections were correct. Many people were moving out. New towns, back in the news, were being built. So Londoners were moving from the dismal slums of inner London out into Hatfield and Harpenden and other places beginning with an H. Stevenage, Hatfield, which is the one I'm missing here beginning with an H? Harlow, thank you. Right, so, what? Milton Keynes, yes, Milton Keynes. Greater Bletchley, as I'm sure they thought of it. Anyway, so many of the post-1965 boroughs, particularly in parts of Greater London, developed rapidly in the 19th century, were changing as well at the point the boroughs picked them up. And I've already mentioned the policy of, by implication, the GLC's Ministry of Transport's policy of ringways, the idea that there'd be rings of motorways around London, and the GLC picked up that very easily as a policy. So politics for housing improvement, mass clearance and so on were very much part of this time of London's history. And of course, unemployment became a major issue. It's so hard to understand it. Within living memory of almost everybody in this room, he said carefully, unemployment, particularly in boroughs like Hackney, was a massive issue. Now, it's still an issue amongst some subsets of the population, but the ease with which it's possible for governments to do things now, assuming unemployment will never go up, is 180 degrees different from the Hackney of 1960, 70, 80, even into the early 1990s. So there was changing economy, radical deindustrialization all the way up the Lee Valley and indeed throughout inner London. So this is the world in which the London Borough of Hackney emerges. The other thing it's worth mentioning, I think, is the massive change brought about by international immigration. So we all know the story of the Empire Windrush arriving in 1948, bringing mostly Caribbeans, but some people from Poland as well. And of course, the population at the time, so the 1961 census, or between the 61 and 71 census, the overseas-born population of London rose from 850,000 to just over 1.1 million, so a 31% increase. Today, the equivalent number is 4 million and nearly 50%. People born, very different mixture of people born outside the UK. So this is the beginning of a massive internationalization of London, in addition to all the economic change. So it's against this backdrop of economic, demographic, cultural, and social change that the London boroughs, including the London Borough of Hackney, come into existence. So why don't I move on now, as time is, to Hackney itself. Just going to add one or two, actually, before I get to the detailed story of Hackney. There's one other thing. It's amazing how many members who've been on the previous boroughs stayed through to the new boroughs, and that is an instructive story. So lots of people who've been on the former borough of Hackney, or Stoke Newington, or Shoreditch, stayed on into the new boroughs after 1965. Anyway, on 31st of March 1965, the new boroughs and the GLC were ready to go. The LCC and the former metropolitan boroughs were abolished. So what about Hackney? So as I said earlier on, Hackney's population, the former borough of Hackney's population was 160,000. Shoreditch's was 43,000 by this time. It had been vastly higher in the 19th century, and Stoke Newington just over 50,000. So Hackney was the dominant part of this new London borough of Hackney. I think it's fair to say that few of the London boroughs, there's quite a lot of competition for this prize actually, have witnessed quite such a roller coaster ride as Hackney's in this period. I mean, others that have had major scandals and problems and so on, you know, could say that they were up there for a prize. But I think the radical change, which is going from the poorest borough in London to one of the most admired, externally admired boroughs with a very different population and radically better off, not everybody, but the population as an average, radically better off, an enormous change over this period. One of the things that the council did in its early days was to oppose, and I've mentioned this already, the North Cross route, which was part of the GLC's motorway box proposal I mentioned earlier. A complex interchange was to be provided at Dalston on the A10, with either a set of slip roads joining a gyratory system formed from existing streets, or better still, those of you who know Birmingham well, a spaghetti junction style interchange. Anybody not seen the picture of Dalston? Is it all embedded on your mind? This catastrophic, it's like the Westway but worse at White City. Picture of Dalston as it might have been. You know, if I'd had an image up there, this is what it would have been. Anyway, there was massive opposition. The scheme was stopped, although 241 yards of a link between the North Cross route and the East Cross route were built at Hackney Wick. During the late 60s and early 70s, so the first years of the London Borough of Hackney, the population fell sharply. Poverty increased, and the borough styled itself as I said a moment ago, as Britain's poorest borough. Interesting thing to do, not the way people do things these days. Local elections in 1977 for the GLC and 1978 for the borough saw the far-right National Front winning about 15% of the vote in some wards, to some extent as a reaction, in the classic reaction to change that had occurred because of the changing demography of the borough. The council was proudly left of centre and found itself fighting racism and other discrimination. Mrs. Thatcher's government was, I think it's fair to say, reviled by many in Hackney's Labour Party, and Hackney joined some other boroughs in outright opposition to government policies of expenditure cuts and rate capping. Hackney, of course, consisted, and had been part of the borough heavily bombed, lots of Victorian housing, some of it deemed slums, some of it bombed. The London County Council and the former boroughs had started a process of replacing the worst housing with council estates, many of which are still there today, the deck access brick-built ones in particular. The area was isolated from the underground. That's a polite way of saying there weren't any stations, meaning that as recently as the late 60s, it was less easily affected by the gentrification that had started to change neighbouring Islington. The east of the borough adjoined Stratford railway lands, now the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and was cut off from the rest of inner London. And of course the Lee Valley, with its extraordinary industrial history, an ancient boundary, which in some, encouraged industry to go there on both sides. So in the early years of the new borough, a number of developments took place designed to replace poor quality housing or derelict buildings with new and improved estates. Council bought up the worst housing and attempted to use compulsory purchase orders from the predecessor authority to purchase, demolish, and replace de Beauvoir Town, which I've again walked through today. These proposals generated conservation groups, some of which I suspect are represented here today, and civic societies opposed to comprehensive development, and not only in Hackney. In his book, A Journey Through Ruins, Patrick Wright quotes Stuart Weir, then a Times journalist, capturing the spirit of the age. So Patrick Wright writes, quoting Stuart Weir, "We're planning to keep the square," said the man who represented the ward but didn't live there. "Oh, that's good," Weir brightened. "They're in poor repair, these houses, but they're really attractive." "Oh no," replied the man from the council, "we're knocking down the houses. We'll just keep the square." Mapledene Road in Dalston similarly had to fight off council efforts to knock it down and replaced it with modernist blocks. It survived to become highly desirable, and of course was at once at one period, the home of former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Now, such stories exist all over London and indeed in Manchester and Glasgow. I'm not picking Hackney out for particular criticism here. And it must be said that policies of knocking down older housing and rebuilding it continued in cities like Liverpool and Manchester, right the way through to the 2000s. So the idea was with us a long, long time. Of course, much of that housing, had it survived and been done up, would have been highly desirable, but that's for another world. Most famously, and it did get a terrible amount of interest, the Holly Street Estate, built to the east of Kingsland Road on the site of Victorian terraced housing that had been bombed during the Second World War. Because of their shape, the buildings were nicknamed the Snake. Blocks were named after trees, such as rosewood and cedar. And according to the architectural historian Jonathan Glancy, quote, "At the foot of the towers are 16 five-story access blocks. At the fourth floor level, these are connected by one continuous quarter-mile-long street in the sky." I've read elsewhere it was a mile long, or kilometres, so long. "This has been a dream rat run for the estate's many muggers and a nightmare for most residents. Those living on the fifth floor have been robbed by burglars who've punched their way through flat roofs." There are loads of books that have this kind of discussion about the Holly Street Estate. Glancy continued, "Holly Street Estate is a textbook example of what went wrong with system-built estates in the 60s and 70s. Though rooms are of a generous size, standards of construction were questionable, and the layout of the estate a disaster. In fact, the estate came to embody problems found in estates not only in Hackney, but indeed throughout the developed world, not only in Britain." So it also, Holly Street, and this is where we get to the challenging bit, fell victim to the council's failed administration during the 80s and 90s. The political struggle of the 80s against Mrs. Thatcher had been lost, at least thank you, and Hackney's controlling Labour group degenerated into factionalism and became effectively incapable of producing a functional administration. Labour split, and this allowed the Lib Dems and Greens to prosper and into the service of the quality of the council's services, and in particular housing, were poor. Town Hall in Mayor Street was regularly picketed by disgruntled trades unions. Complaints to the Ombudsman grew in number. Staff absenteeism increased. Rubbish piled up in the streets. There were broken street lights which went unfixed. Housing maintenance failed. Cockroaches and rats prospered. This was a dismal period, And even The Guardian quoted a resident saying Hackney was Britain's North Korea. It's a place modern politics forgot. However, the Labour Party got itself back together again, and helped by the Conservatives, Labour led by Jules Pipe, the Conservatives by Eric Ollerenshaw, for a time formed a joint administration between 1998 and 2000. Max Caller, now sorting out Birmingham, was appointed as chief executive to get a grip on the borough's chaotic government. But I have to say this was a political problem, not an officer problem. Officers tried to stop all of this and work with it, and it was definitely a political problem. In 2002, the borough decided to go for a directly elected mayor, and of course, Jules Pipe, having been leader, won the first and three subsequent consequences. While he was mayor, I came to see him. And I was given this mug, I Heart Hackney. Well, I'm fascinated by it. You know, you see these stories in the press about people who've got a Ming vase that they've been feeding, or, you know, putting the dog's water in for 40 years. Then they discover it's a Ming vase. Well, I've had this thing since then, so 20 odd years, used it day in, day out, left it in places around the LSE, always comes back. Perfect condition, a triumph of Hackney manufacturing. If it was made in Hackney, of course. Anyway, I've got to move on, haven't I? We're coming to the end. Jerry's here, and I want to quote something Jerry wrote about the politics of the time in his excellent book, London in the 20th Century. And it was about the mess the Labour Party got into. Now, I've said already, the Labour Party pulled itself together, and it's a very different thing. But it's very interesting. I'm going to quote this in full, and I promise I'll then be nearly done. Formation of the Social Democrats. 3 councillors in Southwark joined the SDP, complaining the local Labour Party had been seized by infiltrators. By the end of the year, 40 more joined them. In September that year, 16 Islington Labour councillors and a sitting MP defected, including the remnants of the party's old guard. Complicated. The old guard were very different to the new left, who'd been smarting and seething under the gentrified leadership for more than a decade. In Tower Hamlets and Hackney, especially in Shoreditch, a cruder right-wing and half-covertly racist version of the alliance centred around liberal focus, sometimes recruiting directly from the far-right organisations such as the National Front. In the 1982 London Borough elections, the alliance councillors formed the largest opposition party to Labour in Hackney, Newham and Tower Hamlets, where they take control in Tower Hamlets from 1986 to 1994. This is the bit, given last week's local elections. The old proletarian areas of inner London, which had given birth to Labour in the early years of the century, were the first to defect from a party that now seemed to offer nothing to the white working class. And for the left, their departure was more a cause for rejoicing and bitter ostracism than any attempt to gather them back into the fold. Now, Labour's recovered since then, so I'm not saying the current Labour Party, nationally or Hackney's like that, but if you think about last week's local election results, Jerry got there first. Now, I'm going to stop in a moment because I want to get on to looking ahead. Of course, the turnaround meant that Hackney went from being this very problematic place to, in some ways, one of the most lionised and loved and most interesting boroughs in London. The Overground opened, obviously, connecting many parts of the borough that weren't on the tube hitherto. Those of you who remember the North London line will know just how wonderful the Overground turned out to be. Other things happened. The Olympics come to Stratford. That kickstarts the east side of the borough even further. But the most remarkable physical change in the borough has come in the south of the borough, Haggerston, Hoxton and Shoreditch, where the formerly derelict semi-industrial areas have been engulfed by development and social change, which the borough in its modern form has had to manage and has managed. You know, it's had to manage the fact that people moved in wanting exotic nightlife and now want a quiet evening at home as they've got older. Every time I walk along Charlotte Road and Rivington Street and then Old Street, which I realise is in Islington, I think that. But they've become London's most trend-setting districts, unimaginable in the 60s and 70s. Dalston, which I've walked through again, is one of the most multi-ethnic places in the country. It's home not only to large Turkish and Kurdish populations, but also, frankly, you can see people from the Caribbean, people from Africa, people from Vietnam, for obvious local reasons, and. A remarkable place. And of course, Stamford Hill, since 1965, has seen its Orthodox Jewish population grow to perhaps 20,000, making it one of the largest concentrations of its kind. I think it is the largest, actually. Apart from Gateshead might compete with it, one of the largest ones outside Israel. So contemporary Hackney has become a place of complex cultural and religious integration, but the borough has pulled itself round and is now, by the standards of most of local government, as well run, especially given 20-odd years, 15 years of austerity, as it was badly run. Now, I know I'm running out of time, so I just want to look forward 60 years, the fun bit, to 2085. Everybody in the room will still be here then, I'm sure. Actually, people being born in local hospitals today will be 60, so they'll definitely see this. Will the London Borough of Hackney still exist? Well, history suggests not. Sorry. If you think about it, the vestry, and then there were the District Board of Works, and then the Metropolitan Borough of Hackney, and the other two, Stoke Newington and Shoreditch, and then today's London Borough, but they never last for a very long time. Neither did the GLC, the Metropolitan Board of Works, or the London County Council. The GLA at 25 is doing amazingly well. The trouble is UK governments of all parties can't help themselves. We're about to get, can you believe it, Greater Essex with a directly elected mayor on the edge of eastern London, and to the north, something like Hertfordshire and Buckinghamshire with a combined authority and a mayor and a major reorganisation of local government. The Treasury wants councils with a population of no less than 500,000. Now, I think what happened at the local elections last week might just put the government's enthusiasm down a notch or two for all of this, but let's go through it. If there were to be fewer boroughs, who would Hackney be then joined with, if we're going to follow the logical last time? Hackney and Islington? Different kind of Labour, no doubt. Hackney and Haringey? Different kind of Labour, no doubt. Hackney, the city, and Islington? Fun. Or perhaps a return to the former metropolitan boroughs, but with giving the mayor more power. Relationships between the mayor and the boroughs are a bit scratchy at the moment. Mayor might like that. Not sure the boroughs would. So it sounds fanciful looking ahead like that, but something like it is almost inevitable at some point in our futures. As Harry Truman, the American president, famously said, the only thing new in this world is the history we don't know. Let's hope history will help us come up with a better outcome for the London Borough of Hackney. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have time for some questions, so if you just raise your hands, I'll come around with the mic.
I'll go first only to respond to something you said about the merger of Hackney and Stoke Newington. I arrived here in 1972. The big beasts, Lou Sherman, Martin Otterlanguage, John Cox from Hackney dominated. The Stoke Newington councillors weren't taken seriously and they resented it. Culturally, Stoke Newington has fought back in recent years.
Yes, of course, Lou Sherman famously was leader of the London Boroughs Association. He was a big figure in London government, very powerful figure, yeah. But I didn't know about the poor treatment of Stoke Newington. I guessed it might be true, but now I know it's true.
There's also almost a kind of folk memory that in the southern part of what's now the borough, so around Shoreditch and so on, that what sort of enabled the, I suppose, the artistic explosion of the 90s, etc., was all these ex-industrial buildings and workshops. And the reason they were there was because the council in the 60s and 70s kind of had this very socialist view of like, we can't turn those into housing. They're going to, we need to keep them as commercial property for kind of workers and when they reopen. So, and that decision then spawned something very, very different in the 90s and kind of with the sort of, art and sort of internet boom that happened then. Is that true, or is that just a folk memory?
Well, those on the council will know better, and Jerry might know better, you know better than I would. I mean, there is no doubt that, I'm not sure there was much demand for all that. I mean, I can remember walking along Charlotte Road and Rivington Street after I'd come back from New York, where there were the beginnings of this kind of thing going on in the 80s, thinking, this would be a good place to have that sort of stuff, the sort of New York Soho stuff happening. And then it did. So, I just don't know, whether it was council policy just to keep it, because it was just derelict, most of it was derelict. There was nobody working there, it was just derelict. But whatever did it, it created exactly the environment, the flexible warehouses, older buildings, industrial premises, various, that, by the miracle of better architecture than the 60s, could turn them into, loft living paradise and garrets for musicians and so on. Of course, with the paradoxical consequence, which I've already referred to, that makes them so expensive that nobody can afford, nobody can afford to be artistic there if they're not rich anymore. But that is the nature of cities. Deptford then took over, and then, somewhere else it'll be Bromley eventually next. Well, perhaps not Bromley, but I don't know. Others, did the council, is it council policy, Jerry? You will remember this better than me.
You're going to need the mic, Jerry, with your voice.
As best as I can recall, there was a huge desire to preserve industrial space on the basis that, one of the great things in the mid-'80s was unemployment. I remember when I first came to Hackney Town Hall, there was a banner on the front of the town hall with, which would chart every month the number of unemployed people. And there was an economic development team, and they were desperate to keep industrial space alive. So unquestionably it deterred, any sort of change from industrial to housing uses. But then I can't quite remember when that gave way in terms of the planners saying, well, these places are now becoming just vacant, nothing is happening. There's no real prospect of using old industrial space for anything other than, housing rather than commerce.
To that point, I think it's a great, that last point. I think one way of, though it's not Hackney Council, but it's certainly Labour in London. The GLC and its industrial strategy, a copy of which I have, very big book indeed, on my bookshelves, was definitely, exactly as Jerry suggested, trying to keep traditional industries in London, try to keep docking in the East End, warehousing, and all sorts of things, for respectable reasons, trying to protect the jobs that people had earned lots of money in, and which, when they went, we now know what happened. But of course, when Ken Livingstone appeared at City Hall, not County Hall, all engines reverse. Suddenly, we're all in favour of banks, financial and business services, and Livingstone's extraordinary change, I'm not saying was the reason why it happened anywhere else, but it is for and of itself a remarkable conversion in terms of going from trying to protect the docks, Michael Ward's industrial strategy, through to let's go for towers full of bankers and have lots of arts and culture. And I think that was probably a sort of, that the Labour Party as a whole, as it changed itself, particularly after dismal elections in borough elections in 1990, just got back to, I can remember the late, great Tony Banks, meeting him just after the 1990 local elections, which Labour had done badly in London, saying, we've got to get back to cleaning the streets and making the place look neat and tidy. And so I think the radical change inside the Labour Party saved it, and with it came this change in attitudes to business. Jerry?
I just think that London Docklands Development
The
Corporation.
LDDC, yeah.
Which was, in many ways, I think, an instance of the failure of Labour in the Riverside districts to really get its act together, to say what is now going to happen to Docklands, and where the government moved in, nationalised the whole area and converted it for banking, and that seemed to be a sort of a trigger in consciousness, really, that London's future had a different prospect from that moment on.
Totally agree.
And that's,
yeah. No, I mean, Michael Heseltine, who pioneered that, I opposed it. I thought it was taking power from local government, so I'm quite open about that. I was wrong, because actually, although locals didn't get as much from it as they might have done, which was the big complaint, I'm not entirely sure that the Docklands Joint Committee, which is, was not getting anywhere. And all you need to know about Michael Heseltine as a politician is that there's a Heseltine Institute in Liverpool University where he is revered. I mean, in Liverpool, as one of the very few Conservative politicians, Liverpool and Merseyside, not massively pro-Conservative, but he is seen as having had a humane and original approach to urban development, so I completely agree with Jerry. The Mayor.
Well, we're in the middle of writing and launching our economic development plan now in Hackney, and of course you do want to learn from history, don't you, as you go? And we've met with Deputy Mayor of London, Howard Dorber, met with the Mayor, obviously, with the London Growth Plan. And when Howard Dorber talks about his sort of constellation of London, all the different kind of opportunities, when I've talked about Hackney, I've looked at like the circular economic zone and what can we do with the circular economy, what can we do to support people and give back. So we want to be climate leaders, reduce, repair, reuse, to go into affordable workspaces and to ensure we've got 89 different languages spoken in Hackney. We've got that diverse culture that you've described to make sure that people get the opportunities in a borough like ours that you'd want them to have. The problem is, every time we describe where these things are happening, it tends to be Hackney Wick, places that are still in development, that still have spaces that people can come into. So far, Hackney Wick is a creative enterprise zone, a circular economic zone. It's definitely got kind of arts and culture. But I think the other challenge we have is a sort of a very small footprint, densely built borough, and I've seen the Mayor of London's recent announcements about potentially building on green space, but we're quite protective of our green spaces and unlikely to build upon them in that way. Is that any development that we're doing is either on very, very tiny sites, garage sites, or other sites where you're dropping them entirely and thinking desperately how to create more social housing, given the waiting list that we've got. So I think we have a huge challenge on our hands, and we'll be very keen to learn from the past.
Thank you very much. I mean, I just think that on the learning from the past principle, one of the things I glancingly referred to is in fairness to all concerned, modern architecture didn't really help. Post-war modern architectural styles made lots of London boroughs, the LCC as well, became enormously intrigued by the idea of using idealistic ideas to inform modern architects are system building at the same time. And the world that we've now ended up in is where I think architects, including those building for councils, building new social housing, have learned a huge amount from the past and can now build really nice social and affordable housing. So we have learned, some of the modern social and affordable housing is actually really pretty good. Is another question?
I was just going to say about the is it on? Yeah. The Shoreditch issue. I mean, in the 90s, that was the time when Hackney was a disaster and the planning department was also a disaster. And there wasn't a plan because they were on the cusp of adopting a new plan in about '89, and that never happened because You know, the crash in the operation meant that the local plan didn't go through. So there was an existing one that just carried through. The gentleman is right, there was an aspiration to try and keep workplaces there, and some people will remember, I'm sure, the Hackney Society, the live, work idea of having people come in to work in premises that were essentially industrial and commercial, but also to live there. And that whole sort of thing was happening. And I think the answer is, actually, there wasn't a plan for Shoreditch, you know, in the sense that there was a focus that we wanted it, or the borough wanted it to turn out like it did, but they certainly wanted to keep the warehouses and employment down there.
I know we've got to stop in a minute. I can go on, but I mean, I know there's another session in it. It is interesting how the city fringe, and it's to some extent true of Southwark, Riverside, and other parts of the inner part, the availability of ex-industrial space completely fortuitously made it possible for all these new arts and other activities to flood into them in a way that I'm not sure any planning would have thought through. It was just an accident, and a lucky accident. And the fact is that older buildings, here we are, proof of it today, can be reused. This building wasn't designed for this purpose, but it can be used for this purpose, and concerts and, everything, and worship if people want to do that. So I think the learning to use buildings for different reasons, to have mixed neighbourhoods of different kinds, is something that the failures of the 60s and 70s, by no means unique to Hackney, have allowed us to learn. So, we do this stuff better, I think, these days. There's a question over here. Oh, you're in charge.
Yes, I think we can take this one more, yeah.
Thank you. Two very quick comments, if I can. Add a comment to the statement made about Stoke Newington and Hackney. I wasn't around at the time of the amalgamation, but later on, talking to a number of people who were involved, Martin Arthur Langley, who was leader of Hackney, and John Coates, who became leader of Hackney, their view was that they were definitely going to dominate Stoke Newington because they were all Tories up there. And they were the old hardline, in inverted commas, Stalinist Hackney, also the biggest, that gave them away. But their ultimate rationale, the ultimate explanation that Martin Arthur Langley gave to me was that Stoke Newington wanted the new borough to be called the Borough of Kingsland. The rationale being there was a main road at Kingsland and it ran basically the entire length. And Martin's comment was, we're having absolutely nothing that's got anything with bloody king or any royalty in the name of the borough. Whether that was a Stalinist aspect or not, I have got no idea. But that was his explanation why Hackney dominated. Second comment, very briefly, on the economic development of Hackney. Was absolutely fascinating because the council, right up until certainly 82, was an attempt, a doomed to failure attempt to revive. For example, Hackney set up what it called the London Fashion Centre, which was in Shoreditch, and it was attempting to keep the whole garment industry, one of the better words, revived. It was headed politically by another interesting character called Charles Clarke, who went on to become Home Secretary. That then failed. And what then happened, I think Tony is absolutely right, it was purely fortuitous. There was a coming together private sector, council wasn't succeeding, and the place just exploded.
Very good, thank you very much for that. Now, I know we've got to stop.
Yeah, if you want to come back very quickly on that, that's fine.
Piece of trivia, really. When the boroughs were created, many of them wanted to, on the point of names, wanted to come up with a name that brought the two bits of the borough together, or three bits of the borough together. And Sir Keith Joseph, who was the minister at the time, said no ampersands, no X and Y, and certainly no X, Y, and Z. But he made one exception. Kensington and Chelsea. Now, it's true later Hammersmith and Fulham and Barking and Dagenham were allowed to add the second part. So, as I said, these things, so much personality, individual ministers, individual politicians in the borough, all of us. But in the end, here we all are. Hackney survived and prospered. What more do we need to know?